Dan Grossenbach. I run this little ministry here for apologetics here at Catalina Foothills Church. And it's really, if nothing else, we try to think critically about our Christian worldview. So there's a lot lodged against us and objections, and there's a lot that we want to go out there and share. And so, there's the what of the theology, but we go into the why. That's why we reason why through all of these issues relating to Christianity. So it's a little bit about our ministry. There's always new people here, so I want to introduce you, welcome you to our class. I have a email list that I have. I don't need you on here if you already are on, if you're already getting the emails, but I'll pass this around. Dick, I know you're already on it, so you can just let it pass, but I'll let a pen go along with it. We also have a Facebook page to keep the conversation going, and we're on the website for the church and in the bulletin. So those are the kind of the ways that you find out what's going on. It's always different every month. We're starting something new and very exciting. Peter Pomonis in the back there, you may remember if you were here for the intelligent design conversation that we had 2 weeks in a row, and then even before that, I think you spoke a little bit on intelligent design evolution. And what we're going to be doing is expanding it to a second week, because a lot of these topics are so meaty that we need a follow-up. And Peter graciously offered to continue the conversation. When we have speakers like this, they won't be joining us that second week, but there's plenty that Drs. McGrew are going to be able to allow us to unpack next week. And so it's going to be challenging, but fun for Peter, right? So I hope that you come. Every single month, we're going to do it the following week. So it's the second Sunday is going to be this class, and then the third Sunday of every month is going to be Peter's follow-up discussion in this room, same time, same channel. So next month, we're going to have Alan Schleman from Stand to Reason visit us on video call. You may have realized over the last couple weeks there's been some news. Number one, the Nashville Statement. Has anybody heard of the Nashville Statement? It's a collection of, I would say, pretty conservative evangelical scholars, pastors, and ordinary believers like you and me, who have signed on to this statement of maybe 12 or so points defining the church's stance on same-sex attraction and homosexual behavior and marriage in the church and in our Christian doctrine. So that's been news lately, and there's some from the pro-gay side that have reacted to that. Here in Pima County, you may remember about a month ago, it's now enacted in law, the county enacted an ordinance prohibiting anyone from seeking to change the behavior, sexual orientation, or gender identity of anyone else for a fee. And I've read through the Ninth Circuit decision of the California bill that they had, which was similar to this, but it was much better crafted, and this bill basically makes it illegal for anybody to criticize homosexual behavior or transgender behavior, to the point of a pediatrician cannot suggest against child sodomy or transsexual surgery. So it's bad, it's real bad. So this gets the discussion going. How do we defend these kinds of things where we say Scripture says it's wrong? So Alan Schleman is going to come with his talk, Truth and Compassion, and then follow it up, another easy one for Peter to do the follow-up the next week after that. So as many of you know, I'm a criminal investigator. I want to give two quick examples, one from Lydia's book, and then one from, well actually first I'm going to start with the criminal investigation. This is a case that's been adjudicated, so I can give real names. There's another one I have. There's so many all the time that it's hard to even really remember back far enough to when they were convicted. Everything I remember with all these undesigned coincidences are active cases. So I try changing the names, and I keep messing up, so it's just easier to tell a real story. It's a little bit fun, too. Are you still with us, guys?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So what we have here is, back in 2013, I had a crew that was mailing about $1 million worth of drugs every month, and these guys were doing it just about every day. And so the guys on the top left here is in a UPS store where they're with their boxes. And one day, I was going to ask the UPS guy about this, and then his eyes just get huge. I said, "What is it?" Well, I look behind me, and I see this guy here standing behind me with a box. So they're doing it so often that they were coming while I was there talking to them. So I went in my car, I'm calling for help, because I'm just by myself at the end of the day. They leave, and I follow them. And after some maneuvering, they know I'm following them, and they try to kind of throw me off, but there's two cars. I decide to pick one, and I'm still by myself, and it's this guy here on the left. His name is Francisco Leon Espinosa. Francisco Leon Espinosa, it doesn't really work as well as they do in the training scenario. So I get my lights and sirens on, and I'm in just a plain car, but I stop him, and he gets out. I withdraw my gun, and I say, "Police, freeze." He bolts, he just runs. And there's several fences that he decides to jump, and so here I am, running like Hawaii 5-0 after this guy, jumping the fences. And as I get over this, you can barely see it behind him, a fence. I'm drawing down on him, and then my other partners come in, and it's just like a movie, but it was perfect. So we get him in custody, and we interview him in Spanish, so I'm doing it through one of our Spanish-speaking agents. And she gets out of him that I'm asking all sorts of questions. In an interview, I asked lots of questions for lots of reasons, but one of the things he said was, yeah, I was there, and he was a little skittish on what he was mailing and all that, but I said, who are you there with? He said, it was some Spanish slang word for brother, and then he said his name was Andres, my brother, and then I eventually identified with this guy, fast forwarding a little bit, as Ivan Mungari Kokoba. And so it's a fun name to always say this is my Kokoba case, because he was the main guy. And he was always mailing, and he was very busy, and I had him down. He's real broken English. But I knew that because of a Visa card he used and the statements he's mentioned in conversation that I overheard. Fast forward, he goes out on as a fugitive, and then he's finally caught on a warrant I had out in Las Vegas. And the fingerprints come back as Andres Angel Leon Espinosa. Man, I got the wrong guy. My warrant was wrong. So I have to fly to Las Vegas, testify in court for an identity hearing to prove that he's the actual guy. Because all of my Kokoba case is now the wrong guy. And I'm looking through all of my material, and I see in this interview that he mentions I was with my brother, Andres. And this is Andres Angel Leon Espinosa. So he was lying to me when we first arrested this guy. But there were statements that he said that reflected truth. You can't just say he told nonsense. But it was that one little piece that after I was digging, I was able to bring up in court and prove that that was the right guy. See, reality is a real stubborn thing. You can't change it. When something is true, it's true. You can lie all the time, or you can fabricate things, but the truth will pop up in unexpected ways if it's true. So I'll just mention Liddy. It's not just law enforcement. It's everyday case of human experience. So in a book that Lydia wrote, here it is, Hidden in Plain View, Undesigned Coincidences in the Gospel and Acts, she goes through and lists lots of different undesigned coincidences, but in the very beginning, to explain, you have to use examples. And she talks about, if I can remember the names right, it's Alan, Betty, and Carl. I think that's it. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. Correct me if I'm wrong on this, but there's three
Well, it's an invented case.
Right, okay, that's fine, so I can make up my names too. So during this encounter, Betty and Alan say that Carl said that he was really involved in some nasty stuff, and he was making an admission of what kind of things he was doing. And then later, this fourth unnamed friend says, Carl, you really messed up. And he said, no, I didn't. I never admitted that, and I was never there in the coffee shop. I was never there where they were saying I was. And then so in different interviews, this friend is inquiring and asks Alan, so tell me what happened. Well, yeah, we're at the coffee shop, and then, it was like super crowded. And, then Carl was telling us about his improprieties, and this is just how it happened. Then in a separate interview with Betty says, yeah, I was there, and we're talking, and Carl's telling this crazy story, and then all of a sudden Alan just bumps his coffee over me, and he spills it all on my lap. And if you notice those two subtle mentions of details in those two different accounts show that, well, in one case, it was an ordinary incident of somebody spilling coffee on my lap, is what Betty's account was. But Alan said it was really crowded in there. So combining those two, it's a subtle connection that is consistent between the two. If it's a very crowded coffee shop and you've got hot coffee, it's very likely it can spill. So Did I get that right, Lydia? Okay, spot on. Great. Well, I want to introduce these two. I've delayed it long enough, and we've got a lot of stuff to cover. So I'm going to read off their introductions, and I just want to say this is probably, we've had a lot of great speakers. This is one that I'm most excited about because it's a novel idea that they did not invent. Maybe I'll let them explain that a little bit, but they've really been popularizing it and making it mainstream, which it deserves. So Dr. Lydia McGrew, whose book I have here in my hand, is a widely published analytic philosopher with specialties in probability theory, formal and informal theory of knowledge, and philosophy of religion. She's a homemaker and homeschooling mother, and she blogs on a wide range of topics, including the Bible, apologetics, culture, and politics. Her recently released book, Hidden in Plain View, Undesigned Coincidences in the Gospels Next, revives a largely forgotten apologetic argument for the reliability of the New Testament. And she is one of the most brilliant people that I've had the pleasure of engaging in at least an email conversation. All right, well, welcome, Lydia. We have Dr. Timothy McGrew. I'll introduce him. Timothy, you want to cough or sneeze or say something so you can... Okay, there we go. Dr. Timothy McGrew is professor and chairman of the Department of Philosophy at Western Michigan University, a senior research fellow with apologetics.com, and director of the Library of Historical Apologetics, a well-published specialist in the theory of knowledge and the history and philosophy of science. Tim has spoken at Oxford, MIT, and other universities across the United States and overseas. He's also spoken at many churches and seminaries, answering objections to Christianity and equipping believers to be ready always to give an answer. And Timothy McGrew has also been very gracious, and he's very active on Facebook, and he's able to, I don't want to say too much or get too many friends here, Tim, but he's very good at, for people like me who've had questions, and he'll actually answer them. I mean, he's a great Christian man that's been very encouraging of me and my ministry, and he doesn't even know me. So I just want to extend a warm welcome to Tim and Lydia McGrew. Say they are obviously a power couple, but their intelligence has breeded down to their children in the sense that I have heard a story, I won't name names, but there was a scholar staying at their house who challenged their, what was she, 8 at the time? How old was your daughter maybe when she played?
10.
10. Your 10-year-old daughter to a chess match, and it wasn't quite a fair fight, so what they did was they blindfolded their daughter. And she won, right? In just a few moves.
Wow.
It was a big 25.
Well, that's even harder than she has to memorize where the places are. Anyway, they're brilliant, and I welcome them. You got a big round of applause. And I just introduced a couple undesigned coincidences. And I want to just start, because I know you each have some prepared, right, to share.
Yep.
What I'd like to do, maybe, Lydia, since you wrote the book, if you want to maybe introduce how you think undesigned coincidences are relevant, important, and I just wanted to mention one other thing. With scriptural undesigned coincidences, with biblical reliability, you have two goals: to show that it's been preserved in the text, that the copying is consistent, and that it's historical, that it's a historical account. This is probably the only apologetic approach and method that accomplishes both in one, because you could only weave these threads of truth through if it's been both preserved and historical. So I'd love for you to maybe sell us even more if we're not convinced on undesigned coincidences.
Okay. The thing about undesigned coincidences, can we mute your mic so I'm not getting an echo?
That's right. We talked about that. All right. There we go.
Great. Undesigned coincidences, I like to say, have a dual effect. They show that the authors were trying to get it right, and they show that they were succeeding. So those are the two things you want to look at. Were they, trying to lie? Were they trying to make stuff up? Were they trying to just include legendary material, or were they trying to get it right? And second of all, were they succeeding? A person can try to get it right and not succeed. And the thing about an undesigned coincidence is that it shows us both of these. Obviously, a person can't be getting it right by sheer accident, or at least that's a very unreasonable assumption, especially when it comes to a small kind of detail, such as we find confirmed by undesigned coincidences. So obviously we should not be jumping to the conclusion that they just sort of guessed, what was said in these conversations and so forth. So they were trying to get it right, and then we find that they do succeed. The other thing that I believe undesigned coincidences do is to give us a picture of the kind of people these authors were, which in turn I think supports the traditional descriptions of authorship. Not highly specifically, you could say, well, it could be someone who was very close to the facts but wasn't actually Matthew, or wasn't actually John, or wasn't actually Luke, and that's true. But you put it together with the evidence we have from the ancient church fathers as to who these people were, which in some cases are not people you would automatically expect. Why attribute a gospel to Mark, for example? And you put those things together and you say, well, we can tell from undesigned coincidences that these people seem to have been in the know. And if they were the traditional authors as described, they would have been in the know. Luke would have been a companion of the Apostle Paul. John would have been an eyewitness of many of the events. Matthew would have been an eyewitness. Mark would have been, as we're told, a companion of Peter, who wrote down what Peter was relating. So that would explain what we find. So I think these are very helpful across a wide range of questions that we might have about the Gospels. And what I may do is just change it up a little bit by telling Tim, hey, do an Old Testament one now, and then he'll flick it back to me, and we can back the ball back and forth a little bit here. I want to start with an undesigned coincidence that I find is very easy for people to get. They are going to get it quickly, and it doesn't take long to tell. We find that in Matthew 14:1-2, Herod is musing about who Jesus could be. He's heard of Jesus, he's heard of his miracles and his preaching, and Herod was a superstitious guy. He was not a good guy, but he was a superstitious guy. And he had executed John the Baptist for telling him some uncomfortable truths about his marital relationship. So he had a guilty conscience about John the Baptist. And he says, this must be John the Baptist risen from the dead. Otherwise, why would these miracles be done by him? But the thing that Matthew adds is he adds that he said this to his servants. That's the group to whom he was musing about who this could be. Why did Matthew add this? Now, some people will like to portray the Gospels as if they're sort of, history for the little ones or something. If you've ever looked at curriculum or historical books written up for children that you might check out in a library or something, they add extra details to kind of make it read better, to make it smooth and make it flow. And you might think that's what Matthew is doing here, that he's saying, he said it to his servants. And so the question is, how in the world did Matthew actually know what Herod was saying to his servants? How could he have known that, as opposed to just making it up, and just inventing that little detail? But it is definitely not invented, because if you go over to Luke 8:3, totally different context, you find that Luke is listing women who followed Jesus out of Galilee, who contributed money to his ministry, and he lists Mary Magdalene and various other women, and just in the midst of them is Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's steward. And so suddenly everything is clear, that the disciples of Jesus had a contact within the household of Herod. And I think it's safe to assume that Chuza himself was supportive of Jesus' ministry, or else his wife would not have been doing this. So now we know how word can come back in a very natural fashion to the followers of Jesus of what was being said within the household of Herod. That's just one coincidence. Now I'm going to do one other one, this time between Luke and John, then I'm going to flip it over to Tim for an Old Testament one, and then we'll maybe come back for one more New Testament, one Old Testament. I want to go to Luke 23 and John 8, and I'm going to do a twofer here. You get a couple of these twofers between Luke and John in particular. It's interesting, which indicates that they were talking to different people John 18. Pilate just sort of walks in and says, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Now, if you look at the couple of verses before that, at the very beginning of John 18, when the Jewish leaders bring Jesus to Pilate and try to get him in trouble with Pilate, they don't say that he claimed to be the king of the Jews. And John doesn't mention any such charge. In fact, it mentions this little sort of snippy back and forth between Pilate and the Jewish leaders where Pilate says, "Okay, why are you bringing this guy to me?" And the Jewish leaders said, "If he were not an evildoer, we wouldn't have brought him to you." Kind of funny, it's like, wouldn't you think that they would give a charge? And then they talk about that Jesus had violated their religious scruples. But that isn't going to move Pilate. And then Pilate strides into where Jesus is. He's going to examine him. He's going to interview him. And the first thing Pilate says is, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Why in the world does he even ask that? No such charge has been made, as far as we can tell, in John. So why does Pilate do that? For that, you have to go back to Luke, and it's such a beautiful thing because it's universally acknowledged. I would certainly agree with this, that Luke is earlier than John. John is later. But here it's Luke that explains John. It's the earlier gospel explaining the later gospel. Very interesting. You go to Luke, and you find there a fuller account of the charges. That when they brought Jesus to Pilate, they trumped up this charge. They said, "We found him commanding people not to give tribute to Caesar." This is a complete lie, of course, as we know, because Jesus said, "Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar, and to God the things that are God's." And then they say, and claiming that he himself is the king. All right? So now we get the sedition charge. It's in Luke. In John, we have the outcome of the sedition charge, which is that Pilate has to take this very seriously, and he walks in and he says to Jesus, "Okay, are you the king of the Jews?" But now we come to the next undesigned coincidence, which goes in the opposite direction. Because when Pilate says to Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" we find in Luke that Jesus says, "You have said it." And I do translate that as very similar to our idiom, "You said it." It's a kind of a parallel development of idioms in Greek, which is what they were probably speaking, and in English. We find other places where this is confirmed as an affirmative. At a minimum, even if it was rather coy, "Oh, well, that's what you say." This is not how you answer the Roman governor if you are hoping to get off on a charge of sedition. It was Pilate's business to double down on such things because Palestine was a hotbed of sedition, and they had to watch for that. They did not want people coming in and claiming to be the Messiah, the King of the Jews. And here Jesus says, he's like, "Yep, I am." And then we have this very, very strange thing in Luke, because Pilate goes out to the people and he says, "There's nothing wrong. I find no fault in him." This is as if he said, "Okay, so are you a king?" And Jesus said, "Yep." And Pilate says, "Oh, no problem." And goes out and says to the people, "I find no fault in him. I find no guilt in him." Why does he do that? Here Luke is raising the question, why does Jesus say this and then Pilate is unconcerned? Well, here we have the answer from John. We go to John 18, we get a fuller explanation of the dialogue. So in Luke, we had a fuller explanation of the charges. In John, we have a fuller explanation of the dialogue, where Jesus says, "For this cause I was born into the world," when Pilate asks if he's the king. And he says, "My kingdom is not of this world." It's not an earthly kingdom. And if it were of this world, my servants would fight. There's actually a little undesigned coincidence about that, too. Maybe we'll get to that one in Q&A. This dialogue between Jesus and Pilate is multiply confirmed. It's kind of cool. If my kingdom were earthly, my servants would fight, that I would not be delivered unto the Jews. But now my kingdom is not of this world. Now we understand. Pilate interviews Jesus, and he decides he's a religious crank, but harmless. And so, then he goes out and he says, "I find no guilt in him." So we have Luke explaining John concerning the charges, and we have John explaining Luke concerning Pilate's conclusion that Jesus is guiltless of the charge of sedition. Now, this is pretty impressive, especially because some skeptics and even some Christians will say that Jesus and Pilate were alone when they had this dialogue. And so how did word of what was actually said get back to the Christians to be written down in some sort of historical way? You'll even find conjectures that John might have just sort of invented it, kind of a literary artistry thing. Here's what they might have said to one another and filled it out. Again, like those children's history stories or something. But here we find nothing of the sort. It appears that they probably weren't alone, and in fact, the text never says that they were alone. What it says is that the Jewish leaders themselves did not enter into Pilate's hall because they didn't want to be ceremonially unclean. But it does not say, and there was nobody else with them. They were absolutely alone. There probably would have been guards. Maybe some of Jesus' friends would have been permitted to be there. Maybe John himself was there. We don't know. But it looks like probably at least two other people who were sympathetic to what was going on were there. And that Luke talked to one of them, and that John maybe was the other one. And we get these interlocking accounts because that's what you get in witness testimony, as Dan, I'm sure, will confirm, that they don't tell the whole thing. A witness doesn't say every single little detail of what happened. It's what occurs to him, it's what he notices, it's what he happens to remember later on, it's what's important to him. You get these variations, okay? But truth is always consistent. And because truth is always consistent, when you get one person telling one part of the truth and the other person telling the other part of the truth, these will come together to make a complete and a consistent picture. So those are a couple of New Testament ones. I have another New Testament one, or whatever we have time for, but I'd like to flick it over to Tim now to show an Old Testament one.
All right, so I'm just going to pick this up and go. I have several of these prepared, but I thought I would start by picking a period in the history of Israel that we sometimes hear about when we're thinking about stories that we teach in Sunday school. And that's from the history of the Judges. I want you to see if you can notice something that is strange about following things. So let's start with Judges chapter 3. If you've got a Bible, feel free to flip it. We're going to be going through a number of things in Judges here. Judges chapter 3, there's a guy named Shamgar who kills a large number of Philistines, and it's in Judges 3:31. And the funny thing about it is, he's not using a sword. He is fighting using an ox goad. You can kind of see how it's kind of like a poker for your fireplace. That might be better than nothing, but it's not a weapon of war. And you're wondering, okay, that's kind of weird. Why did he do that? Maybe the story's just told because he used a weird weapon. But then we keep reading in Judges, and we can see Judges chapter 5, verse 8. Samson's got to fight the Philistines. What does he use? He uses the jawbone of an ass. Didn't he have a knife? Didn't he have a sword? Why is he using the jawbone of an ass to do his fighting? Just an odd thing. And it keeps on going. In Judges 14, he's headed down into Philistine territory with no very friendly intentions. And he's attacked by an adolescent lion, a young lion. And apparently he's unarmed because he has to kill the beast with his bare hands. What the heck? What's going on? Why don't these people understand that they live in a dangerous world and they should go armed? All of that is stuff that I remember hearing in Sunday school, but I never put it together with something that we find not in the book of Judges, but in 1 Samuel 13, where it says, this is before the time of David, that the Philistines had a ban on allowing the Israelites to have smiths. When the Israelites were under the influence of the Philistines, if they wanted their blades sharpened, just the blades they would use for reaping wheat, they had to go down to the Philistine towns and have a Philistine smith sharpen the blade. It was kind of like disarming a population that you think might otherwise prove troublesome. And so all those little points in Judges come together. I think that's probably a plausible explanation for why the Israelites began working with the sling. A sling can be easily made. All you need is a little bit of flax and some stones, and you can whip one up. And that was not viewed initially by the if you go into 1 Samuel 17, the story of David and Goliath, favorite Sunday school story, one of the things that Goliath says when he sees David come out to him with no sword and just a sling is, what does he think? I'm a dog. This is a weapon for chasing away stray dogs. And then, of course, it proves to be much more than that. But there's just a little bit of harmony there that we can see. All of these odd, by-the-way weapons, an ox goad, the jawbone of an ass, nothing but your bare hands, but you're Samson, so it works out okay, or a sling. Why don't we see what we saw in the time of Moses? Plenty of people had swords in the time of Moses, but now, in this later era of the judges, when they're under Philistine oppression, they don't have weapons. It's because they were not allowed to have smiths who might have made such weapons. I think that's one small interesting point of detail. One data point like that, you might say, well, that could just be a coincidence. But when you begin to chain together a bunch of them, you realize, kind of like putting together a jigsaw puzzle, once you can see the puppy's nose and his eye and part of his ear, you will not listen to the clever modern biblical scholar who tells you that these pieces aren't from the same puzzle after all. Lydia, back over to you.
Okay, so I'm going to go to the book of Acts. We're jumping around, but I think that should be kind of exciting and interesting because now my book, I'm going to hold up a copy. I think Dan held up a copy already. My book is all New Testament. It's not Old Testament, but we have these in the Old Testament as well. They're just spread out a little more. I would say the density is much higher in the New Testament than the Old, for one obvious reason, which is that it's all about a much more tightly connected time period. All right, the events in the New Testament take at most something on the order of 60 years, whereas maybe 62 years or something like that. Whereas the events in the Old Testament are covering hundreds of years. So and they're from a different genres, like Chronicles of the Kings or that kind of thing. And they're just covering a much wider scope. They don't go into as much detail. So you get a different density of undesigned coincidences, but you do have them in both. So now I'm going to go to the book of Acts. And this is a wonderful sort of cross-genre set of connections from a just amazing book called The Horai Paulini by William Paley. It is available online for free if you just look that up. Or Tim or I can send you the link. You can get the whole thing because it's in the public domain. This was the book that first really, really drew my heart to Undesigned Coincidences. I got the argument from Tim. Even though I wrote this book, I first got the argument from him and read The Horai Paulini on a train journey and was just blown away by it. However, as it happens, the particular one I'm going to do, I found, it's one of the very few that I found on my own. Most of them I got from Paley. But Paley gave me the idea of connecting the letters of Paul to the book of Acts, because many of the time periods are the same, that they would have been written at about the same time, or they would have been written about the same time, concerning the same time. In his epistles, Paul will often talk about his ministry among the people, and here's what happened, and here's how it went. This is partly because Paul is a little bit defensive sometimes, and sometimes he's telling how things went when he was with people. And he just has such this sort of warm, affectionate heart, and he wants to recollect his ministries. And those ministries in those cities often occurred during the time periods that are covered and recorded in the historical book of Acts. Now this one, it helps if you have access to a more modern translation. So I want to start with Acts 18. And Acts 18 verse 5, and I'm going to read it from the NASB, the New American Standard. Just going to back up a little bit. After these things, he left Athens and went to Corinth, says verse 1. And it says he found servants because he was a Jew. He wasn't permitted to work with his hands on the Sabbath. So he works during the week. The tent making is his day job to have the money to support himself and his companions. And then on the Sabbath, he's not allowed to work anyway, and that also is the time when all the Jews are going to be joined together in the synagogue, and he goes and he preaches in the synagogue. But something changes when Timothy and Silas come from Macedonia. One conjecture is that this pattern changed, that his ministry model changed, and that he was able to stop working with his hands during the week and was able to continue his missionary work during the week. Now, why would that be? Well, maybe they brought him money. It's just a thought, it's a theory, it's a conjecture, that when they came down, if they had brought him money, a contribution, he would have been able to stop. Well, we can confirm this contribution. We can go to 2 Corinthians 11, verses 8 and 9. Paul is there protesting that he didn't take money from the Corinthians when he ministered in Corinth. So he's recalling this time period when he first set up the church in Corinth. And he says, when I was with you and I was in need, I wasn't a burden to you, but the brothers who came from Macedonia supplied my need. So here we find a confirmation that some group of brothers, some Christians, came from Macedonia and brought money to Paul while he was ministering in Corinth. Just what we conjectured might have been the case from Acts. But look how indirect this is. I mean, it's not even entirely clear in Acts what's going on. What this makes me think is that the author of Acts knew that Paul changed his ministry model, that he became even more intensely missional after the arrival of Timothy and Silas from Macedonia. But he may not even have known exactly why. Maybe he guessed, but he may not even have known, but that he saw from his own observation that when Timothy and Silas came from Macedonia, Paul became more completely devoted to the word and testifying that Jesus was the Christ. This supports the conclusion that the author of Acts was a personal companion of the Apostle Paul and actually saw what was going on. And yet it's supported in so indirect a way that I don't think there can be any question that the author of Acts, copied this or got this idea from the epistle to the Corinthians. He may not even have read the epistle. In fact, I tend to think he did not read it. But he knew that something changed. So I'd like to flick it back over to Tim here to do another Old Testament one.
All right, let's go back to the history of King David. You'll remember that most of the trials in David's life arose from his sin with Bathsheba, and in particularly, he was unfortunate enough to have his own son Absalom rebel against him and to try to seize the kingdom from him. So this one is a kind of an interesting one. What we're going to do is we're going to go back to the book of 2 Samuel, and I'm going to chain together a couple of things all in 2 Samuel. So for those of you who are using Bibles, I guess now that includes those of you who have your Bible on your cell phone, that's where you want to go. So we'll be looking at things between chapters 11 and 23. Let's start with 2 Samuel 15:12. In 2 Samuel 15:12, we read that there's a priest named Ahithophel who joins Absalom in his rebellion against David. So far, that's not really perhaps noteworthy. I guess Ahithophel would have needed some priestly people. He found somebody, so what? But then, when you look at 2 Samuel 16, verse 23, you discover Ahithophel was really well respected, and he's been a trusted counselor of David for many years. His counsel was considered to be like consulting God himself. If he was that close to God, and if he was that close to David, why, when the rebellion takes place, does he go off on the other side? Why does he go with Absalom? Now, the curious thing about this is that you can read the story of Absalom's rebellion, and you can go back and forth over it, and you don't find any motive given. You can't discover a motivation. Why would Absalom join in the rebellion? But we can piece together a pretty good explanation for his motivation if we look around a little bit more widely. So, two things about 2 Samuel 23. Flip forward there if you want to keep a finger in the earlier passage, that's fine. But in 2 Samuel 23, verse 34, we learn that Ahithophel had a son named Eliam. And Eliam was a member of David's army. He was a soldier. And in verse 39 of that same chapter, 2 Samuel 23:39, we learn that another soldier who's in the same cohort was a comrade of Eliam, and his name was Uriah. That name might ring a bell. What ties it all together is something back in 2 Samuel chapter 11. We discover that Eliam had a daughter. Now that would be Ahithophel's granddaughter, because Eliam is his son. And his granddaughter's name was Bathsheba. And she married Uriah. And now things come full circle. Now we can see what's going on. David had dishonored Ahithophel's granddaughter. And in an honor and shame culture, where honor and shame are the coin of respect, David had lost Ahithophel's respect. And now it's not so much of a mystery why Ahithophel would join in a rebellion against David. He considered probably that David was no longer worthy to be the king of Israel. Small things, and the smaller they are, actually, the better in a certain sense, because these are stories that I read as a child, I heard taught as a child. You probably did too. Did any of you ever notice that connection? Did any of you ever even think about it? How absurd then to suppose that this is some kind of clever forgery. Forgers don't write things that we're going to have to wait 3,000 years to have someone come along and figure out. This kind of indirect connection has the ring of truth. Lydia, back over to you to do something outside of the New Testament.
Okay, so I'm going to do another one connecting Paul's letters to the book of Acts. This time I'm going to go to 1 Timothy 1:5. Paul is talking to Timothy about his background. And he says, I'm mindful of the sincere faith within you, which first dwelt in your grandmother, Lois, and your mother Eunice, and I am sure that it is in you as well. And for this reason, I remind you to kindle afresh the gift of God, which is in you through the laying on of my hands. All right, so we just get a couple of names thrown in there. His grandmother's name was Lois, his mother's name was Eunice, and that he was taught the faith of some kind. And we'll see a little bit better about what that was in a minute by his grandmother and his mother. And then if we go to 1 Timothy 3, verse 14, it says, you, however, continue in the things you have learned and become convinced of, knowing from whom you have learned them, and that from childhood you have known the sacred writings, which are able to give you the wisdom that leads to salvation through faith, which is in Christ Jesus. Now, if Timothy was learning these sacred writings from childhood, these are what we would call the Old Testament. And we can conjecture from this that Timothy's upbringing was Jewish, that he was raised learning the Tanakh and the Torah from his grandmother and his mother. Who is missing from this picture? Dad. Where's Dad? All right? If Timothy was from a devoutly Jewish home, you would expect his father to be involved in his religious upbringing, certainly a lot more than you would expect his mother and grandmother to be teaching him and to be involved in his upbringing. So where's Dad? We can conjecture things. We can say, well, maybe he died. Maybe his father was dead. Or we can conjecture that maybe he wasn't a Jew. That's a possibility. A Jewish woman, if she married a Gentile man, the offspring were still regarded as Jewish, and that's true to this day. That Jewish identity, ethnic named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was a Greek. And he was well spoken of by the brethren who were in Lystra and Iconium. Paul wanted this man to go with him, and he took him and circumcised him because of the Jews who were in those parts, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. Okay, and here when it says his father was a Greek, it does not mean a proselyte to Judaism. It very clearly means a Gentile, Greek. Now, the author of Acts brings this up just to explain why Timothy wasn't circumcised already. Okay? There is no reason to think that the author of Acts had access to 1 Timothy. In fact, I would say it's undeniable that 1 Timothy wasn't even written yet. I would just, even before Acts was written, I don't think 1 Timothy was written. And besides, if someone were wanting to base his history on that letter, I do not think he could resist bringing in the name of the mother. If we're going to mention his mother, we had a name presented to us on a silver platter, and we've got grandma. We've got grandma's name. There's not even a mention of grandma in Acts 16. It's just this fact. The author of Acts is telling about Paul's travels, telling how he first became acquainted with Timothy, who's going to be mentioned quite a lot in the remainder of Acts, and how he had to circumcise him as an adult because he wanted to try to avoid, he unsuccessfully tried, to avoid giving offense to the Jews because they knew that Timothy had not ever been circumcised. So he mentions his mother was, and it's very specific, a Jewish woman who was a believer. So this also explains Paul's apparently knowing Eunice pretty well, because she wasn't just a Jewish woman, she was a Christian Jewish woman, but his father was a Greek. So we find again confirmation of the knowledge that the author of Acts has. The author of Acts knows stuff. He knows about who Paul's companions are and whether they've been circumcised or not, for goodness sake, kind of a private thing for him to be knowing about Timothy, and who their parents were and what race and ethnicity their parents were and so forth. But he hasn't gotten that from some other source. He seems to know it from his acquaintance with Paul and Paul's travels. Now, Dan, I'm wondering if you want us to turn it over for a question and answer a little bit at this point, or I think, we could do more, we could do whatever you want.
Some of these coincidences don't deal directly with theology, and I know you make the distinction, just to mention it, Lydia, in your book, that some of them deal with just mundane circumstances that the writers find themselves in, and some of them involve miracles, like feeding the 5,000, or circumstances closely relating to a miracle. What's the significance if they're just ordinary mundane examples for the most part?
My response as somebody who works in history is the more mundane, in a sense, the better, because there are no theological motivations for putting in little details about, Jesus' itinerary or Paul's dealings with Timothy. The less that people can ascribe these to theological motivations, the better they tell us that these are works written to the facts and habitually truthful. And so, there are interesting undesigned coincidences. There's a whole network of them surrounding the feeding of the 5,000, which is clearly an important, miraculous event. It does a lot to put Jesus on the map in Galilee. People are really, they're by the time the event's over, they're practically ready to seize him and make him become king by force. But the really interesting thing about this is these don't seem to have been planted by the authors deliberately at all. That's the whole point of their being undesigned. And so it's better that way if nobody can say, well, maybe you got these because people were trying really, really hard to make a theological point. They don't make a theological point. They just show us that the authors are truthful and well-informed.
I completely agree with that. I want to really confirm what Tim said there. And what's great is that even when they're about miracles, they're about the mundane details about miracles. So in the feeding of the 5,000, it'll be like, what color was the grass that the people were sitting on, or what time of year was it, or whatever. And what I often say is, it's like if you sample a loaf of bread at one end and at the other end and in the middle a couple different times, and it's all good bread. At a certain point, it becomes sort of silly to say, maybe there's a bad piece in there somewhere that we just had come out that's moldy or spoiled. We've got a representative sample. And so in our work with Undesigned Coincidences, we find that they're both miraculous and non-miraculous events that they concern. They're, mundane details and other kinds of things, and they're all across the books, they're in different books in all different directions, and so that it's this very representative sample, and it tends to destroy any notion that there's a historical core that is true, and that the rest of it is not. It all seems to be true.
So a few months back, we had an interview with the president of the local stake for the Mormon Church. And so we really went through a lot of doctrine and a lot of history. And like our faith, theirs is founded, so they claim, on historical claims, both in the Book of Mormon and in the history of Joseph Smith, its writer. So what he does a lot of the time was to fill in a theology or history that might be missing in the New Testament and Old Testament. They would say, because it's true, we challenge that. But for example, the Book of Moses, the Book of Abraham, some theological truths such as what heaven is like or how we're saved and things like that. So if we were to take their historical claim, their claim to history in the Book of Mormon, for example, we would see some coincidences, right? We would see that we know the life of Abraham. Now here's some life of Abraham we didn't know before. So that would be a coincidence of sorts, a coincidence of design, we would say, right? And I see this all the time. Whenever there are witness statements in cases, they never overlap completely. That's why you get multiple witness statements. And what makes it more powerful to a jury in trial is that you have little differences with each of them, and they weave this historical story. And even if one says something that another doesn't. Bringing it back to Mormonism, though, I could see a skeptic hearing this, and I hear it all the time for other areas of apologetics. What about Mormonism? You don't believe Mormonism? Well, you have some coincidences. How would you fend that off or say that those are not undesigned coincidences?
I'm going to let Tim take that one first, and then if he doesn't say something I want to say, I'll say it.
Okay, the first thing is that actually, when you look at Joseph Smith's writings, you find that he's making very heavy use, both directly and indirectly, of his King James Bible. And so the kinds of things that are even possible connections between the unique things that he has and the things in our canonical scriptures are, at least so far as I have been able to discover, entirely things which one guy can place in order to make it seem like he's filling in details and making connections. But you mentioned Abraham, and since you did, this leads me to my favorite Mormon scripture. It's a part of Pearl of Great Price called the Book of Abraham. It seems that Joseph Smith obtained, and this much is true, he obtained some Egyptian papyri from a traveling peddler and paid a pretty penny for them, and then he sat down and he translated them with the help of some obscure means, since he had never studied Egyptian hieroglyphics, and he came up with a very dramatic story, which he published as the Book of Abraham. And let me just give you a scene from that Book of Abraham, chapter 1, verse 11. There's a wicked priest, and he's slaying some young maidens on an altar, and on this altar he slew these maidens. These were daughters of Onita, straight from the loins of Ham, and he slew them, for they would not worship gods of wood or of stone. Wow, this is a pretty exciting story already, and we're only 11 verses into the book. And then the papyri disappeared. So who knew how much of that Joseph Smith was making up out of the back of his head? Well, wouldn't you know, back in the early 1960s, they resurfaced, and we know that they are actually the ones he was working from, because they are pasted to the back of a map of Kirtland, Ohio, that's got his wife's handwriting on it. So we know that this is the right stuff. The Mormons were ecstatic. They thought they'd been lost. They immediately sent them to the University of Chicago, and they had an Egyptologist translate these documents for them. Actually, they gave them to 3 different Egyptologists. So I'll quote that same verse from the translation by Klaus Baer, Egyptologist at the University of Chicago. this is for a publisher named Mormon Journal. Translation of that same verse I was just telling you about. Is in the pool. This is a standard text in Egyptian burial mounds. It's from the Book of Breathings. It's kind of like the short form version of the Book of the Dead. Every one of the Egyptologists translated it the same way. Joseph Smith was making up stuff out of the back of his head. Now you see how dangerous it is just to make up detailed things. You can get caught doing it. Which is one reason why a lot of people who are making stories up will go deliberately vague. What'd you do this afternoon? Oh, I ran a bunch of errands, says the husband who doesn't actually want his wife to know where he went. A bunch of errands is helpfully vague. But if he said that he went to the grocery store, then she might have said, oh, well, that's funny. I was there too. I didn't see you. Oops, don't want to trip on that. So often, not always, but very often, liars will become vague in their lies. Joseph Smith didn't think he was going to be caught, so he went full-bore detailing. And what happened? He got caught. So, yeah, Abraham, wow. What a book. What a tale.
Very clarifying. So we just have to take all the circumstances into account. We can't just say, well, Mormonism has coincidences too. We can go on to show how to believe it's false, as you did.
Oh. You got to come up a little closer.
Okay.
I'm not hearing you.
Okay. No, I was just saying, coincidence isn't just a coincidence. You have to take all the circumstances into account. And
That's
you can
right.
show for
Yep.
whether it's true or false.
Right. Also, there's a complete absence of archaeological evidence of battles that the Book of Mormon says took place. We should at least have found a few, arrowheads at the Hill of Cumorah, but there's nothing. And Mormon archaeologists, I want to give them this. They're honest. They'll admit they got nothing.
Yes, that's right.
And so that's pretty telling.
Questions? What do you guys think? Okay. Peter.
Dan, I'm curious what this does to the school that says the Synoptic Gospels were really from one single source. What does that do to that?
Yeah, so Peter was asking, what does this do to the criticism or the claim that all the Gospels basically come from a single source and they're just copied from that?
Yeah, it blows that claim completely out of the water. And I should be honest. The most popular theory right now, probably the most popular, is the two-source hypothesis for the Synoptic Gospels, and it's particularly the Synoptics, not so much John, but that the two sources would be Mark and the unfound Q, the hypothetical Q, and that those would be the two sources, and then that you've got some extra material that Luke added, some extra material that Matthew added. But I think we find a lot of independence, and so much independence that the two-source hypothesis, I mean, whether Q existed or not, or whether Luke and Matthew made some use of Mark or not, I'm not even saying is untrue, but that it cannot account for anywhere near all that we have. And in the book, one of the things I did very carefully was I have tables, and I code in them for something that shows the independence of the Synoptic Gospel, and that verifies the Synoptics, by the way, again, are Matthew, Mark, and Luke, okay? And that verifies the unique material that's found in that Gospel. And then I especially code for Matthew's independence of Mark, because it's so popular right now to think of Matthew as not really being Matthew, not really being written by Matthew, and as not having access to the events except through Mark as his source, and again, possibly Q. But when you find a coincidence in Matthew that is completely independent of Mark, can't have been gotten from Mark, and not, especially if it's unique to Matthew, so it wouldn't be in Q either, because Q is what's common to Matthew and Luke. So that's gold, and we have several of those, and I have them coded in the tables. John is a completely separate thing. Nobody really thinks John was just based on one source. People think John was just a this amazing thing, the more they tell us, the more opportunity they have to turn out to be right. So, insofar as that kind of theory is making it sound like they had no independent access to the truth, it's shown to be false.
Okay, good. That's helpful.
Can I just add something to that, Dan?
Sure.
So, you'll notice that she was talking about material that's unique to a particular gospel. The very first example that she started with Matthew 14, the story of the death of John the Baptist, you have to be very careful in checking these things. A lot of people will say, well, he just got that from Mark because Mark also tells the story of the death of John the Baptist. It is true that Mark tells the story, but Mark's gospel does not have, and Luke's gospel does not have the phrase, to his servants. That is unique to Matthew. So even in cases where the general story being told is the same story, it's the details that matter. And that detail cannot have been copied from Mark for the simple reason that it's not there anymore.
Okay, so the two things would be chance or design. Chance being they're just lucky and it just happened to be you're finding things in a massive document that you're just cherry picking these because they're bound to have some coincidences the bigger you get. The second thing would be that I'm anticipating, I haven't heard these, but the second thing might be design. Either somebody like Joseph Smith is a forger and he's so in his mind convinced of it that when he's doing multiple different stories, it's so ingrained in his mind that the coincidences just come up because he's got these characters so down that it may appear as a coincidence, but it's all a design forgery. Or the second kind of a design I'm imagining is like two criminals who are in a fraud scheme and they have to conspire together. I'm curious to know, out of those live options, how do we quickly deal with them, and is there any credence to them?
So when I think about sheer coincidence, what I start thinking about first of all is how improbable it would be to get these right by sheer coincidence. And the more obscure the fact, the harder it would be to get it right. It's amazing. It would be amazing if somebody just happened to know that Paul suddenly changed his ministry model in Corinth out of a clear blue sky when Timothy and Silas arrived, but the person had no connection to the events. He just guessed it right. Or maybe it isn't true, but it just looks like he got it right. It just looks like it's confirmed in 1 Corinthians. And Paul's talking about something completely different in 1 Corinthians. Because the events are intrinsically improbable, having both of them then becomes even more improbable. If it's sheer coincidence, in probability, you have to actually multiply those probabilities for their being completely independent. So the more, if it were just something general, you'll sometimes hear skeptics say, yeah, in Spider-Man we have the city of New York, okay? We are not talking about things on the level of the city of New York exists. We're talking about highly specific things. So that, I think, disposes of the sheer coincidence one. Go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to try to turn my mic up, but I think you can hear me.
Turning my mic up. Are we good? Okay.
Yeah.
And then as far as various kinds of design, I'll usually point to the casualness of them and the fact that they would not do the forger much good. And Tim mentioned this earlier concerning some of the Old Testament ones, how hard they are to notice. This is absolutely true. Many of these are not noticed. And I actually firmly believe that when someone is forging a document, he tries to do things that are a little more obvious. If he's going to try to make it look real by adding something that he happens to know independently is true, he's going to draw attention to that. Whereas you find that Acts does nothing of the kind. It doesn't draw attention to it. John, when he leaves stuff unexplained, like why did Pilate ask, are you the king of the Jews? Why would he write his own story in a deliberately confusing way and just count on somebody to go and look it up in the other one? These are too subtle and too, in a sense, carelessly done. They just say stuff, and it turns out to fit together, and you might not even notice that it fits together. I consider that that's a very strong argument against their being design.
Yeah, it's just so simply intuitive, right? It's something that everyone can understand just from human experience. Now, we went through maybe 5 or 6 different UCs, we call it for short, Undesigned Coincidences. How many, Tim, maybe a question for you, since you
you're aware of a lot of the Old Testament and a lot of what Blunt and Paley has mentioned. I guess Lydia, you would as well. How many do you think, if we were to number them, the known undesigned coincidences through all of Scripture, if these folks pick up Lydia's book or Blunt's or William Paley's, how many could we add together?
Altogether, a couple hundred, I would say, is probably a good estimate. If you look in Paley's Horai Polyni, which is a book that Lydia mentioned, just between 4 epistles, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, and the book of Acts, just those 4 epistles, he's got over 40 just there. And he goes on through all of the other epistles. There are coincidences linking epistles to other epistles. There's the whole crisscrossing network of a couple dozen of them that have been found so far among the Gospels. And I have to say so far there, because frankly, well, occasionally we're still stumbling across new ones that no one seems to have unearthed. And most of Blunt's book is actually devoted to Old Testament undesigned coincidences. So I would say probably a couple hundred is a reasonable ballpark figure for the number of them. And that's part of the point. It's, if you're reading Moby Dick to clear up the questions that were left over when you put down The Lord of the Rings, well, you're in trouble because they're not anchored in the same historical reality. But even if you happen to stumble across something that kind of looked like maybe it fit, you'd get maybe one. We can calibrate this. We know what fiction is like. Fictions don't fit together like that, and especially fictions in the ancient world. We know what the forged documents of the 2nd century were like, the Acts of Paul and Thecla, the Infancy Gospel, the Gospel of Thomas. They don't interlock with one another in any of their unique material like this. So we can calibrate our expectations.
That's good.
I wanted to also add something about the numbering in my book, and I make note of this in the book. I say this, that sometimes I'll have something numbered, but it's what you might call a 3-fer or a 2-fer or something, that they're sort of packed, So in the one about Apollos, for example, I talk a little bit about Apollos. There's maybe 2 or 3 connections between what Paul says about Apollos in the epistles and the book of Acts, and this happens quite a bit, that I can't really disentangle each one of them to give it its own numbered section, because sometimes they're all very, very tied in together, especially the ones in Acts. So the numbering in my book could be a little misleading as far as the number of what you could count as coincidences.
It's just overwhelming. It just keeps coming. And your book breaks it down in nice little sections where the epistles and like the Gospels are vice versa, and the known Pauline epistles. So I encourage everybody to get that book. The last question I have, we're up against our time frame. I don't want to overextend my request for you guys. You've been very gracious. I wanted to ask, though, in your encounters, both you, Lydia, and Tim, with skeptics, how has this been received? Is it more something that really builds up the believers in their confidence, or do you see it compelling to those skeptics?
I'll answer first there. It makes a big difference whether the skeptic is somebody who's looking for the truth or whether he's looking for a clever one-liner. And the one-liner that I have heard from a couple of skeptics is, all you've got are coincidences, which just doesn't make any sense. The same person who says that is the person who says, I don't know, I think they're talking about something like prophecy or something, showing that he's never even actually bothered to engage with it.
Yeah, I'm seeing the same thing. I don't have a lot of contact with what I would call honest seeker skeptics. So unfortunately, I haven't been able to see what the effect would be upon an honest seeker skeptic, because I'm not encountering any right now. But the others are clueless. And what Tim was saying is true. This is new to them. This is sort of hitting them out of nowhere. And all they have are sort of these very cheap shots that really show that they have no idea. All you got is coincidence. Ed Babinski is out there continually making up, spinning on. He's an internet infidel, spinning out extremely improbable alternative hypotheses. I was just hearing Jay Wallace this weekend, and he kept saying, "Don't go with what's possible. Go with what's reasonable. Anything is possible." And Mr. Babinski has not learned this yet. One that I have seen is, this hasn't been discussed in a peer-reviewed journal. Actually, as Tim has pointed out, in the 19th century, historians it's like he didn't even bother. So they're really, they're not certainly not saying anything compelling in response.
Well, and that's his big thing. Why all the difference? How many angels were at the tomb? You know, what do we do with that? So he uses that as a big critique. So he should study it. I'm with you though, Lydia, on finding those honest, earnest, spiritual seekers. They're out there, and every once in a while we kind of encounter them, but it's few and far between. Last thing, I said the last thing before, but the last thing, how do people find more about you guys? I know, Tim, you do a lot on classic apologetics, so I'm wondering if you can point to the website that you have a lot of the material from apologists long ago that bring up the same.
If you want to find some of these books for free, and they are in the public domain, there's no copyright problems with this, you can go to historicalapologetics.org, and you will find that you can just browse the library, download these things, and read them on your own computers. If you become really interested and you want more interaction on this, I would suggest joining a Facebook group like the Christian Apologetics Alliance. There are some really wonderful people out there who have expertise in numerous fields. We can't all be experts in everything. So if I need expertise in comparative religion, I know somebody who's got a doctorate in that I can ask, and he's active on there, he'll answer. So it's just a really good thing. You can pick up books about this. You can pick up all the books we were talking about, except for Lydia's, which this is not in the public domain, sorry. But yeah, we just encourage people to read as widely as possible on this.
Great. And
I would
Lydia,
definitely.
I was just going to say, I know you've got a blog out there, so you want to pitch that? There's a couple of different
Right.
domains.
So first thing I'm going to say is read my book.
Yeah.
It's also on Kindle. So if you like Kindle, $9.99 on Kindle from Amazon. But actually, I don't want to just stop there. I wanted to mention Brian Otten, who is in Ireland. He has a website called Apologetics 315. He has a Tim McGrew page on there, and so I'm not going to like spin out an entire URL. But if you just go to apologetics315.org and you search for Tim McGrew, it'll say audio resources. There are a lot of Tim's talks that he even did years ago, including on this. Tim also did a 6-part series for a blog, and I'm trying to remember what was the name of that blog, that you did the 6-part series on Undesigned Coincidences. Is it the Christian Apologetics
I think
Alliance?
it was the CAA blog, yeah.
Christian Apologetics Alliance blog, and Tim did a whole 6-part series. I think a lot of those were from ACT. You can also go to what'swrongwiththeworld.net, and that is a group blog to which I contribute. I contribute a lot of stuff. You can click on my author page, and then if you find a post on there about New Testament or about apologetics, and they like it, then there are tags down at the bottom. You click, and then that'll take you to all the other things under that tag. And if you even just go to lydiamcgrew.com, I'm treating that as my author page. That's going to have a link to a personal blog of mine, and there in the left sidebars, there you can look for evidentialism. You can look for apologetics. I think I put most of my posts there under evidentialism. So you can just search tags on these things to find additional posts on all kinds of topics relating to apologetics material. But there's a ton of stuff that Brian has put of Tim's at Apologetics 315 that I think you'd like to see.
Great. Well, you both have been very gracious, and I want to thank you for being here.